Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast. This is a podcast series on personality and the building of character. I've called it Be the Best You Can Be because, in my opinion, this is the best way to fulfill our most important of desires, that is, to maximise well-being for ourselves and for those around us. And an important way to maximise well-being is to understand one's own personality and to have the skills to recalibrate it to function more wisely in everyday life. And that is what I mean by the development of character. I'll go on to argue that developing character also requires a moral framework that gives direction or goals for this recalibration of personality. The guiding questions are always, why do I need to change and for what purpose? Character development is hard and long, but as Friedrich Nietzsche famously put it, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Wise goals make the very hard work of character development both worthwhile and bearable. And I think that the only sensible goal for self-development is the cultivation of well-being in self and others. Why others and not just self? Well, because I don't believe you can sustain well-being without others. Compassion and kindness to others accelerates our own character growth and our own happiness, and it appears to be a natural outpouring of enlightenment. But more on this later. So you'll see that all in all, there's quite a lot to address, and thus it will take a few podcasts as I try to break the topic into reasonably discrete episodes. So this first episode will address the questions, what is personality and why does it matter? Podcast 2 will suggest practical strategies for adaptive change. And this naturally raises the highly debated and yet very important question of whether you can change personality, including how can we recalibrate our natural preferences when needed. And podcast 3 will then apply all this to the development of character and a practical moral outlook. So to our main topic today, what is personality? Well, collectively, personality traits can be understood as a preference system. The traits predispose us to like or dislike something, to prefer one thing over another, to approach or avoid situations, and so on. As such, they motivate us, they predispose us emotionally. And a key thing, these preferences typically happen outside conscious awareness. They are deep biases that are subsequently reflected in our thinking. In other words, we're all unavoidably biased. Our resulting thinking tends to rationalize what we already feel. It's as if our inner lawyer argues the case for our feelings, and this is what we normally experience as objective thinking. So why are we designed like this? Well, these preferences are a part of the very fast, quick and dirty appraisals we make of the world in order to respond to life's quick-flowing demands. As Ortega y Gasset once said, life is fired at us point blank. We can't possibly think through everything, sitting down cross-legged to contemplate every action. As a species, we wouldn't have survived very long on the African savannah. So it's in this context that personality traits evolved as problem-solving strategies in dealing with an incredibly complex, changeable, largely unpredictable, and often dangerous world. So they're heuristics or rules of thumb that work pretty well much of the time, except when they don't. And there'll be more on that later. So thankfully, most psychologists now agree that we can bundle our preferences, these personality dimensions, these preferences for thought, feeling and behaviour, into 5 distinct categories known as the Big Five. These 5 personality traits explain most of the variance in personality, thus they're called the Big Five. The research evidence for them is very strong, so we can have confidence that we're talking about something real, something we can have considerable trust and faith in. In addition, research from behavioural genetics indicates that, like hair and eye colour, we're largely born with our personalities, and they typically don't change huge amounts throughout our life. Along with intelligence and our physical inheritance, health, appearance, capabilities and so on, our personality characteristics are the main means by which we channel the world. In terms of survival, relationships and work, these preferences determine the style of how we go about just about everything that we do. So we're attracted to certain personalities are attracted to us. We can also conflict with certain personalities and they with us. Our personalities also predispose us to certain ways of operating in the world, intimately, among our friends, and of course, how we go about work. Given all of this, to maximise our happiness in life, I think we need to do 3 things. First, understand and fully accept our personality. Second, select and curate environments, these can be relationships, friends, work roles, habitats, that are compatible with our personality. And 3, calibrate and adapt as best we can where we're out of sync with our environment, but always in the service of well-being. And wisdom dictates that we get on with this without, where possible, detracting from the happiness of others. Given we're a super social species, much of our happiness actually revolves around managing other personalities in non-zero-sum ways. That is, we seek to generate win-wins where possible via a ever-dynamic mix of self-interest and reciprocal altruism. I'll touch on that more in the following podcasts. But for now, what are the Big Five personality dimensions like? Well, firstly, they each vary on a continuum from very low to very high and are distributed as bell curves, where most people cluster around the 50% average. The further we move towards either tail of the distribution to the high and low scores, the more unusual, the less people in the population that have that degree of these personality features. And these extremes of high and low bring predictable strengths, but also predictable distortions in our approach to reality. As we'll see, knowing these strengths and distortions in ourselves is of supreme importance in increasing well-being and happiness. Also, the further apart we are on each dimension from other people, the harder it is for us to understand and accept them. This is part of what's known as the egocentric bias, a universal projection of self onto others. You'll see this reflected when you observe others as if they're aliens, and you'll say things like, well, I'd never think that. I'd never say that. Well, I'd never do that. Well, of course you wouldn't, because they're quite different to you. But guess what? They have the same bias towards you and have the same righteous reactions. It is really hard to accept these profound differences without moral judgment. It's as if we feel they're just trying to be bad or difficult or just different. Whatever the reality, we're sure we're right and they're wrong. So I'll have more to say on this in the following podcasts, as it's central to understanding much conflict, righteousness, and therefore relational challenges. And of course, it's not all about being on the extremes of personality. On average, most people are, average. Being average on dimensions has a big advantage. It allows us to understand both sides of the equation, and we can flex our style to be a bit more or a bit less as required by circumstances. It also allows us to understand and accept a wider range of people. From an evolutionary perspective, natural selection has deemed that being average is, well, excellent. And finally, given personality is largely genetic, we aren't responsible per se for how we are predisposed, for how we were born. We are, however, responsible for our behaviours, a topic I'll focus on in podcast 3. Ignorance, while understandable and very common, is not a defence for bad behaviour. And just before we dive into the details of the 5 dimensions, if you're interested in measuring yourself and want reliable results from a Big 5 personality test, look for questionnaires based on the International Personality Item Pool, the IPIP, such as the one offered online by Psychology Today. So, here are the Big 5, starting with the trait openness to experience. Now here, the contrast is between people who range between inventive and curious on the one hand versus those who are consistent and cautious on the other. Openness to experience reflects how receptive we are to new ideas and experiences. Those who are open to experience can generally be described as intellectually and artistically curious, more daring, with a keen sense of beauty. They may excel in creative roles, are often found in academia and design teams. They tend to avoid jobs that require strict adherence to a set of rules and guidelines. Generally, being high on openness indicates a personal preference for a variety of activities over a strict routine. Those who score higher often prefer novelty, innovation and change, and on average are more politically progressive. Those who score low tend to be more conforming. They value tradition and prefer routine. They tend to be uncomfortable with ambiguity and change and tend on average to vote more conservatively. Such people may have superior job performance in areas where procedure takes precedent over everything else. They likely take pleasure in repeatedly executing well, and their motto could be, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Sometimes the contrast between these two extremes is that those who are high on openness create the value, and those low on openness exploit the value. Clearly, both are very worthwhile contributions. A second dimension is conscientiousness. And here the contrast is between people who tend to be more efficient and organised versus people who are more easygoing and carefree. Conscientiousness refers to one's tendency towards self-discipline, dutifulness, competence, thoughtfulness, and achievement striving, especially goal-directed behaviour. This preference focuses on the amount of deliberate intention and thought that a person puts into his or her behaviour. So individuals high in conscientiousness prefer planned rather than spontaneous behaviour, and they're often very organised, hardworking and dependable. And numerous studies have found a strong positive correlation between conscientiousness and achievement, including academic success. But problems for highly conscientious people occur when plans go awry, when they fail to meet exceedingly high, often perfectionistically and often self-imposed standards. They can be prone to worst-case scenario thinking with all the attendant anxiety and worry. People who score low in conscientiousness take a more relaxed approach, are more spontaneous, may change their mind and their commitments, and they might be disorganised. They may be less able to delay gratification and more prone to follow their impulses. On the other hand, their spontaneity can be more fun and on occasion a superior strategy when circumstances require snap decisions. And generally, they're more relaxed and tend to smell the roses, so to speak. So a third dimension is extroversion, and its polar opposite, of course, is introversion. The key contrast here is between people who are more outgoing and socially energetic versus those who tend to be solitary and socially reserved or introverted. An individual who scores high on extroversion is characterised by high energy, positive emotions, talkativeness, assertiveness, sociability, and the tendency to seek stimulation in the company of others. These people report gaining energy from social interaction. They can be experienced by others as too full on or exhausting, as well as not giving space for people who are quiet or reserved. Those low on extroversion prefer solitude or smaller groups and enjoy quiet. They prefer activities alone and tend to avoid large social situations. Introverts are not universally shy or depressed, but they may struggle to be heard and thereby can be less appreciated and influential in some social contexts. They can find social and physical stimulation to be more overwhelming and prefer solitude, time to process emotions, and fewer but often more intimate social connections. They often recharge their energy away from other people. Another very important, and this time social, dimension of personality is agreeableness. And here, the key difference is in social or interpersonal perception. And the contrast is between people who tend to be friendly and compassionate versus those who are more competitive or antagonistic. So agreeableness measures one's tendency to be compassionate, courteous, helpful, and trusting. Viewing the social world as ideally harmonious, high agreeables are cooperative rather than suspicious or antagonistic towards others. Agreeable people consider social harmony to be the most important and thus may find it very difficult to deal with conflict, make difficult interpersonal decisions, or give bad news. In such situations, they might feel guilty, they might make concessions, they might suppress their own needs to keep the peace. Generally, high agreeables tend to underrate their own value or needs and make trades or deals that are more favourable to others. Low agreeableness is demonstrated by people who tend to elevate their own interests above others. They view reality as largely a competitive domain in which the obviously right thing to do is to compete to win. They are more likely to perceive relations as unfair to them and therefore to become antagonistic if they don't get their way. Thus, less agreeable people tend to feel anger rather than guilt in conflicts of interest and place self-interest above getting along with others. Sometimes their scepticism about others' motives causes them to be suspicious, unfriendly, and uncooperative. This can cause resentment and discomfort in others, leading to difficulties in relationships. They tend to make trades or deals that are often more favourable to themselves, and this, of course, can alienate them from others. And finally, the dimension of emotional stability. This one contrasts people who are more sensitive or more anxious versus those who are more secure or calm. Low emotional stability is characterised by the tendency to experience more unpleasant emotions such as anger, anxiety, depression, or vulnerability. Neuroticism is a facet of this, and that refers to an individual's degree of emotional instability and lower impulse control. So people high in neuroticism tend to worry more. A way to understand this is to say they're more sensitive. And this can also apply to their physiological response and their nervous system sensitivity. As such, low stability can act as a type of emotional amplifier for emotions triggered by the other personality dimensions and life's challenges. Now, in contrast, people who score high in emotional stability tend to be calm and even-tempered. It should be noted, though, that relative freedom from negative feelings for those who are very emotionally stable does not mean they necessarily experience a lot of positive feelings. They may struggle to empathise with more sensitive associates and can therefore be experienced by others as unfeeling or distant. Because their emotional amplifier is dialed down low, they may have a flatter inner emotional experience. Now, for all of us across these dimensions, almost none of us are average at the 50th percentile across all the dimensions. So to varying extents, we all have natural distortions built into our perceptions and preferences. For example, extremely high conscientiousness generates lots of false negatives from worst case scenario thinking, and so can generate unnecessary worry. Or very low scores on openness makes a person very averse to change, while very high scores can make a person take too many risks. High agreeableness usually means people are well liked, well loved, but they can be taken advantage of. Being very low on agreeableness can make a person hard to get along with, but perhaps they're more likely to be successful. Remember, we have no choice in this genetic lottery. Knowledge of this should engender tolerance for diversity, compassion for others, as well as compassion for self. Also, all personalities are normal, as each dimension is literally distributed on a normal curve. In these terms, there is no abnormal personality. Nonetheless, not all profiles are equal nor socially desirable. Combinations of the personality dimensions make us who we are. They are what makes us unique. They can also help us understand both desirable and undesirable personality configurations. Once we get extremes in the dimensions, there is a likelihood of systematic strengths as well as distortions in our appraisal mechanisms. And here are just a few interesting combinations. Very low agreeableness with high extroversion and relative emotional stability. This is a typical narcissistic profile. Very low agreeableness and low conscientiousness is often reflected in psychopathic tendencies. Very low agreeableness and low emotional stability are often seen in borderline personality disorder. People high in agreeableness and low in stability are frequently natural empaths. And my favourite, the sucker triad, which is a combination of high intelligence and high conscientiousness and high agreeableness. So why the sucker triad? Because high intelligence and high conscientiousness are very useful to others. People generally will want to tap into them for their own benefit. Having high agreeableness makes it hard to say no to their often unreasonable requests. Thus, often, the epithet sucker for this profile is appropriate. Here's some more examples. People who are very low on agreeableness and conscientiousness, and especially with lower intelligence, are strongly overrepresented in our prisons. Very low conscientiousness often leads to unreliability, and relative to a person's intelligence, opportunities and skills, it leads to underachievement. people who have very low emotional stability are much more likely to have anxiety and depressive disorders, all things being equal. Now, all this is not genetic determinism, but average predictions that are supported empirically. Therefore, where we have less desirable preferences, we ought to become aware of them and do our best to recalibrate them. This is wisdom based on knowledge, intelligence, and moral commitment. Is there an ideal personality? Well, the simple answer is no. While on average across millennia, it's been most adaptively successful to be in the middle of the bell curve on the 5 dimensions of personality, in many circumstances, being some distance from the mean will be adaptive. To take one dimension, agreeableness, as an example, very low agreeableness may be rewarded in specific contexts such as war, the trading floor, litigation, and so on. By contrast, high agreeableness may be rewarded in stable and peaceful circumstances where cooperation and community-minded preferences would be most adaptive. So, as with many things in life, it's horses for courses. Understanding personality is so important because it gives us access to unconscious drives and motivations without the need for extended psychoanalysis or therapy. We can become aware of the distortions and non-adaptive predispositions in our nature, and then make practical adjustments to live better, happier lives. We can also use this knowledge to become better people in relation to others in order to enjoy the benefits of reciprocal altruism. And it's to these topics that I will turn in the next 2 podcasts. But for now, why not assess yourself on the Big 5? And whatever your profile, try to accept it with grace and self-compassion. Armed with that knowledge and insight, you can then turn your attention to the practical matter of being the best you can be. As always, wiser people than me have put this better. So I'll leave you with the words of Oscar Wilde, who, with typically wry humour, said, "Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken." You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you like the podcast and want to know more, my website is www.drchris.life. There you'll find links to my various social media posts, a newsletter, and lots more. And share the podcast with people you like so they can like it too.